Most Azure Virtual Desktop or AVD environments are wasting money every single month. And the scary part is most IT teams don't even realize where it's happening. It's usually not one massive error. It's 5 or 6 small design and operational decisions that quietly blow out your Azure bill. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly where that waste normally sits, why it happens, and what you should be doing to fix it first. The reason AVD is attractive to so many organizations is that it changes the economics of virtual desktop infrastructure. Microsoft positions Azure Virtual Desktop as a cloud VDI service, and it gives you control of configuration and management whilst using a pay-for-what-you-consume model, right? They also highlight that AVD is fully optimized for Windows 11 and Windows 10 multi-session, and this is one of the main mechanisms for reducing costs compared to that one user per VM design we're kind of so used to in traditional VDI. That's the promise anyway, right? But the problem is that a flexible consumption model only works in your favor if the environment is designed and operated intentionally, right? If it's not, the same flexibility that should have saved you money actually becomes the reason the bill drifts upwards over time. There's a lot of public cost guidance from Microsoft especially, and it makes the point quite clear. AVD costs are charged to the organization that owns the deployment. And if resources are no longer needed, those resources must be removed or deallocated properly. And this is going to stop that unnecessary consumption. In other words, AVD does not magically optimize itself just because it runs in Azure, right? The customer, as in us, we're the consumer, right? We still own the support and infrastructure decisions and that ongoing cost management discipline around it as well. The first reason people struggle to optimize AVD costs is that they talk about the AVD bill as if it's one thing, when in reality, it's several cost layers that are actually combined. Microsoft separates AVD cost into 2 broad categories, really. Right, first there's user access rights and licensing, and then there's Azure resource consumption costs. For many internal users, access rights may already be covered by eligible Microsoft 365 or Windows licensing. And that means the infrastructure side becomes that main area where teams need to focus. Right, that's fair enough. And again, Microsoft really explains this quite clearly, that this infrastructure cost includes session host VMs, storage for managed disks, network bandwidth, storage accounts, and other supporting services that keep the environment available. It's also important to know that if you are using Microsoft Entra ID together with Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, or even Microsoft Entra Domain Services, right, there can be additional identity-related infrastructure costs, including the cost of a domain controller VM, the storage for it, and the networking. That really matters because a lot of teams optimize the obvious line item, session host, but ignore the supporting services surrounding those hosts. Let me give you an example, right? You can save some money by resizing a VM, but we still have profile storage on an oversized premium tier, domain controller VMs running for a dependency you no longer need, and weak session density that forces too many hosts to stay online. You've not solved the real problem. If you've only reduced one symptom, Microsoft's pricing guidance reinforces that view because it doesn't describe AVD as just desktop VMs, right? It actually describes it as a set of Azure resources that together they deliver the virtual desktop experience. So the first mindset shift is very simple. You're not optimizing AVD in the abstract. Okay, you're optimizing a stack of Azure resources that collectively make AVD work. The AVD cost documentation states that session host virtual machines usually cost the most, and that the same Azure compute, charging, and billing mechanisms for normal VMs apply to AVD session hosts. Those charges typically include the VM instance itself, the managed disk, network bandwidth, but the VM runtime is usually that sort of biggest contributor. What that means is most real savings will come from how many hosts run, how long they run, and how well they are utilized. This is where people often make their first major mistake. They design around worst case fear instead of observed demand. They choose larger VM sizes than they need, or they keep more hosts online than they actually user concurrency requires, because they want to try and avoid those logon delays or the performance complaints. That thinking is understandable. I've done it myself in early days, but it becomes expensive very quickly in that sort of pay-as-you-go platform. Microsoft's pricing page emphasizes that AVD supports pay-as-you-go, supports reservations, and Azure savings plans for compute. But all 3 of those pricing approaches still assume you are using the right amount of compute in the first place. If you're running oversized or underutilized hosts, discounts help, but they do not fix that poor design. Another issue is that people look at the sort of host count, but they ignore user distribution. In pooled environments, cost optimization is not just about turning a host on and off. Okay, it's also about how effectively you pack user sessions onto those hosts. If user sessions are spread too thinly across too many machines, your environment might look healthy from like a performance perspective, but still it's going to be financially inefficient. There's a lot of auto-scale guidance as well. Specifically, it requires a configured max session limit for sort of pooled host pools, and it recommends avoiding that sort of default setting. It tells you immediately the session host sort of density is a core design factor, not just an operational detail. If your maximum sessions per host are not set realistically, your scaling logic cannot make sensible decisions about when to add or remove capacity. So, when you review compute spend, the real questions you should be asking are the VMs the right size for the actual workload? That's question one. Question two, are you actually running too many hosts at once? Again, very sensible question. Another question, are user sessions being distributed in the way that supports both user experience and efficiency and that sort of consolidation? A lot of organizations assume that once auto-scale is enabled, cost optimization is effectively solved. Microsoft's own documentation shows why that assumption is actually quite risky. They explain that autoscale allows you to scale session host VMs up or down according to schedule to optimize deployment costs, and that you can choose from sort of power management autoscaling or dynamic autoscaling. With sort of dynamic autoscaling, I believe it might still be in preview. They also make it very clear that you should not use autoscale and an alternate automation-based scaling method such as Azure Automation or Logic Apps on the same host pool. In other words, scaling needs a deliberate operating model, not sort of a mix and match of overlapping automation methods that just essentially constantly fighting each other. There are also very hard prerequisites that, again, many organizations and IT teams miss. And again, it's clearly stated in the documentation around AVD, right? Scaling plan configuration data must be in the same Azure region as the host pool configuration. Pooled host pools must have a configured max session limit. Azure Virtual Desktop as well must be granted access to manage the power state of the session host. So the RBAC controls need to be right. And the RBAC permissions are required to assign that service principal role as well. There's an AZ140 lab guidance as well, and that goes even further. And it notes that assigning the role sort of below the subscription scope, this can actually prevent autoscale from working properly. So make sure you're assigning those permissions at the right level. Now, even if those prerequisites are all met, autoscale can still be configured badly. Again, if you look at Microsoft documentation, scaling plan process includes ramp up, peak, ramp down, and off-peak phases. And they each have their own settings such as minimum host percentage, threshold behavior, and load balancing strategy. So if your team copies a sort of generic schedule and they're not understanding, when users actually connect, right? What concurrency looks like through the day, and things like how long hosts are actually taking to become ready. How aggressively do you actually want to consolidate sessions as well, right? All these things matter. If you don't take all these into account, then all you've done is automated the wrong answer. It's also a really important decision caveat as well for sort of personal desktops. I'm not a big fan of personal desktops, Windows 365 for me, but still, Microsoft states that if you want to use personal desktop, auto-scale with Hibernation, FSLogix and AppAttach do not currently support Hibernate. So Hibernation should not be enabled if you rely on those sort of technologies for sort of personal host pools. And that's a good example of why cost optimization cannot be treated as a silo. A saving in one layer can introduce a limitation in another. So autoscale is powerful, but only when it is tied to multiple things like correct permissions, right? Very important. Realistic host pool settings as well, okay? And a very sensible schedule. And an actual understanding of user demand. Look, if you want more AVD and Azure architecture content at this exact level, practical, technical, and based on the actual Microsoft documentation rather than recycled fluff, make sure to subscribe to my channel. I'm building this for people who design and run these environments in the real world. And for those who follow me, they'll know that I have launched my new channel, the IT Geek Network. So I appreciate everyone's support. So once teams focus on compute, the next blind spot is usually user profile storage. Microsoft recommends using FSLogix profile containers with AVD to manage and roam user profiles and personalization. They also explain that a profile container stores the complete user profile in a single VHDX or VHD file. And at signing, that container is dynamically attached so the profile appears to the operating system like a native local profile would essentially. Right? Also highlights several benefits of this approach. These include strong performance, support for Microsoft Outlook cache mode, and OneDrive support in sort of non-persistent media environments. Those are major benefits, which is why FSLogix is so widely used. But they also mean profile storage becomes a critical part of the environment, rather than an afterthought. The AVD profile guidance that Microsoft gives as well, it recommends either Azure files or Azure NetApp files for the sort of storing those profile containers. Right, it's that backend storage. That should immediately tell you that the storage layer matters both for performance and cost. If you choose storage that's too expensive for the workload, you overspend. If you choose storage that is too weak, users are going to complain about logon and session host experience. Cost optimization here is about sort of balancing performance requirements against sort of profile behavior, not just selecting the cheapest tier on paper. There's also a deeper issue as well. Profile containers grow, right? They accumulate application cache, log data, sync content, and users profile artifacts over a long period of time. Again, if we look at sort of FSLogix configuration guidance here, it recommends putting in certain registry settings. There's one called delete local profile when VHD should apply. You should set that to 1, for example, and this helps avoid users falling back to local profiles. And there's a flip-flop profile directory name as well, and this should also equal the setting of 1. And this makes management of profile container directories much easier. Those are just some of the settings, and these are operationally important because profile sprawl, duplicate local profiles, and poor profile governance all increase support effort, and these can lead to confusing storage growth over time. Really, something very else that's important as well, and Microsoft point this out in their documentation, is that if you configure a profile container, you don't need to, it's like a separate one for ODFC containers, because the profile container already includes Microsoft 365 application data. Again, that matters because some teams are still overcomplicating profile design by splitting components unnecessarily. This increases complexity without creating a meaningful cost benefit. So when a team says, our AVD cost is too high, one of the questions that I would always ask is, have you reviewed not just the host pool cost, but also the behavior and lifecycle of your FSLogix storage? Because if you haven't, you are missing a major part of the picture. Another reason cost reviews often miss a target is that they look only at the visible desktop layer and ignore the supporting footprint. Again, if we look at the cost guidance from Microsoft, it explicitly notes that identity provider choices can affect charge components. If you are using Microsoft Entra ID only, your identity cost profile looks one way. If you're combining Entra ID with Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, then you've got domain control VMs, storage, and networking, and these become part of the environment cost. That does not mean those components are wrong, right? But it does mean they should be treated as part of the AVD cost model, rather than like a separate invisible background dependency. Security choices can also affect cost and complexity. Again, if we look at the sort of recommendations around security for AVD, it explains that while Microsoft secures the Microsoft managed part of the service, right, that responsibility model, the customer remains still responsible for areas such like session hosts, applications, data, the access control, and deployment configuration. Microsoft also recommends the security controls such as multi-factor authentication, MFA, conditional access, patching as well, endpoint protection, and broader session host security hardening. Those are necessary, but they also mean that a secure AVD environment is not just a desktop plus Azure, right? It's a full operating environment with supporting services, policies, and controls. And some of those controls are going to carry a cost, even operational overhead, that this needs to be planned intentionally. The important point I want to make here is not to frame security as a cost problem. It is to recognize that cost modeling without architecture modeling is incomplete. Okay, if you carry legacy dependencies, duplicate services, unnecessary identity infrastructure, or avoidable complexity, your AVD spend reflects that architecture whether you realize it or not. Okay, there's loads of documentation around this, right? And Microsoft repeatedly separates the Microsoft My Responsibilities from the customer My Responsibilities, okay? And that separation is a reminder that the customer still owns a large part of the economic outcome. If I were reviewing an AVD deployment and the goal was to reduce waste without damaging service quality, these are the first sort of areas I'd review. First of all, session host runtime. Okay, how many hours per day a host actually powered on, and how much of that time is actually productive usage versus idle availability? Microsoft's autoscale documentation exists precisely because unused running hosts create unnecessary cost. Number two, I'd look at VM sizing. Okay, are the session hosts sized around actual observed workload demand? Or were they sized once, during deployment and never revisited? Again, if we look at the pricing documentation, it's quite clear on this that VM instant cost is usually the biggest driver. So right sizing is one of the most high impact reviews you can actually do. Third, I'd look at max session limit as well and session density, right? Has the host pool been configured with a sensible max session limit? Or is it effectively scaling around a meaningless default? Again, there's explicit wording in the documentation that says not to use a default for pooled host pools using autoscale. Which brings me, it's a nice segue to number 4, which is autoscale configuration quality. Does the scaling plan use realistic ramp up and ramp down timings? Are the right permissions in place, right? Is the host pool using a coherent scaling model instead of a partial automation that's stitched together with multiple tools? Again, I mentioned this earlier around the guidance. It's very clear that autoscale should not be mixed with separate Azure automation or logic app scaling on the same host pool, okay? I'd next look at my FSLogix storage platform and that sort of profile growth, right? Are profile containers on the correct recommended storage platform? Are they growing uncontrollably, right? Is the environment using the recommended profile container approach rather than adding unnecessary complexity, such as the separate ODFC design that I mentioned earlier, right? When it's not needed. And then look at identity and supporting dependencies, right? What supporting identity infrastructure is actually running behind the environment? Is it still necessary? Do you need domain controllers? Do they have to be in Azure, right? Again, if we look at cost documentation, it's explicit that identity model choices affect cost components. That review sequence that I've just mentioned there does matter because it prevents teams from chasing tiny savings while missing that bigger structural causes of cost waste. So if you take one thing away from this video, it should be this. AVD cost waste is usually not caused by AVD itself, right? It's caused by poor alignment between architecture, scaling, storage, and real user demand. The biggest areas to review, okay, these are session host compute and runtime, autoscale design quality, session density and host pool configuration, FSLogix profile storage behavior, and the supporting identity or infrastructure. When those areas are designed and managed properly, AVD becomes a very different economic proposition. If you want to go deeper, the next video breaks down where your Azure money actually goes in an AVD environment, compute, storage, bandwidth, identity, and the hidden layers that people often miss. And look, if there's a specific area you want me to tackle next, if you want me to go deeper into autoscaling or FSLogix, Windows 365 versus AVD, for example, or even security or architecture, anything, put in the comments and I'll build it into my sort of video plan. Make sure to subscribe as well. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.